Okay, in this video, I'm going to model for you how to write appropriate to the task, purpose, and context of a rhetorical situation. So this skill comes from AP's learning targets, obviously. But really what that means is that if you are given a writing task, it might be an ACT prompt, it might be an AP prompt, it might be a task that you kind of develop for yourself. How well can you write something that's going to fit that task? Can you achieve a purpose in that writing? And is it going to fit the broader context or the context that's surrounding it? So like I said, in real world, so to speak, but in your AP exam, that means reading the three FRQ prompts and being able to respond with an appropriate thesis to make the right argument. But in life, it means that when your boss shoots you an email and says, hey, can you write up this presentation for the next meeting, can you pick out what the task is? Can you pick out what the purpose is? And can you understand the context surrounding it? So that's really our target. Now the document I have on here should be attached to the assignment in Schoology. And what I'd like you to do is to have that exported in OneNote. If you don't already, go ahead and pause the video if you need to take a second to do that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark on this, and then I'm actually going to write an introduction. So your assessment for this level is asking you to pick apart a prompt and then write appropriate to that rhetorical situation, right? So what we're going to do is 1, pick apart the prompt. 2, talk about how we write an introduction that suits a rhetorical situation. And then I'm going to model for you how to go ahead and write that. So you'll want to have this document for yourself. If I write on my document, I suggest you write on your document so that you can have the same notes for your reference in the future. All right, let's start with the prompt right here. Many people spend long hours trying to achieve perfection in their personal or professional lives. Similarly, people often demand perfection from others, creating expectations that may be challenging to live up to. In contrast, some people think perfection is not attainable or desirable. Write an essay. Now I'm going to start underlining because that is our signal, right? Write an essay that argues your position on the value of striving for perfection. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensible position. Provide evidence to support your line of reasoning. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning, and use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. So I underlined my task statement. Remember, every time we see that write an essay in the stable wording, that is going to signal our task. But I'm also going to circle a few keywords. So this one says, write an essay that argues your position on the value of striving for perfection. I'm going to circle value and perfection because those are kind of the key ideas. And the reason I'm marking those is those should probably show up in my thesis because I want to make sure that I am very carefully and very clearly answering that question, okay? So looking at this question, the first thing I need to do as I look at the prompt and after I've marked my task, figured out my keywords, is I need to really figure out what am I supposed to write about. So one way that I like to do that is I like to rewrite it as a question. So for this one, the question would be, what, if any, because I don't have to say there is or isn't, value exists in striving for, actually no, I'm going to start over. I think a better way to phrase this question is to say, is there value in striving for perfection? I like to kind of rewrite it as a core question because then I know constantly what I should be answering in my paper and I know what answer I need to provide by the end of my essay. So this is one way of kind of narrowing your task, but rephrasing it as a question can be helpful. So that said, my next step is to kind of take on a stance. So to kind of recap, let's keep a running list. Where should I put it? The first thing we did was read the prompt, right? The second thing we've done so far is underline the task and circle keywords. The next thing I did was I clarified the task to make sure I knew what I was doing, right? With the question, oops. And that's kind of the process of picking out a task, narrowing it down, and making sure that I'm going to answer the right thing. Because the next step is really to kind of come up with my opinion. So if I were to give my opinion, this question or this task can go two ways. If you either think there is value in striving for perfection, or you think there isn't value in striving for perfection, you might also do what's called qualify it and say, it's good to strive for perfection, but it has limits. So that's the argument I'm going to make. My stance is, I'm going to word it kind of simply. It's kind of my thesis and where my thinking is going, but for right now, it's just kind of a rough draft. I'm going to say striving for perfection. I was going to say is beneficial, but I want to use the language of the task. So I'm going to say has great value, but should never hinder, is that the word I want? Reach a point where it's harmful. So my argument, to simplify what I wrote there, is that yes, perfection and striving for perfection can be really beneficial, but it has its limits, and you kind of need to be cognizant of your personal limits in deciding how far you can push that without starting to hinder your mental health or things like that. So this is kind of my stance, right? I've kind of clarified what I want it to be. The next thing that I want to do is kind of figure out that big picture. So when I say big picture, the terminology that's from your previous unit is broader context. So when we talk about the broader context, we are talking about not necessarily the context that's going to happen immediately before or after something, but the so what, the big idea, the value, the thing that we can connect to as a writer that other people can connect to as well. Because remember, our goal here is to write appropriate to a rhetorical situation, and part of that is appealing to an audience. So we want to really focus in how do we make sure we kind of broaden this into a context that lots of people can connect with. Now, I would say perfection, for example, is a pretty broad context. Perfectionism itself is an abstract big idea. But we could go a little bit further. For example, I talked about mental health. That's a broader context when we're talking about striving for perfection. I could talk about ambition in a positive or a negative way. I can talk about personal growth. I can talk about perseverance. I'm not sure I know how to spell that. I can talk about a growth mindset. These are kind of all larger picture things that I can connect to. And the reason that I kind of want to start with these big ideas in mind is that that's kind of where we want to hook in our reader and engage them in the conversation that we're going to write about. Now, yes, your AP reader, they're being paid to sit and read your essay, but we always want to write in a way that's going to be engaging, in a way that's going to bring them in. It shows that we're a sophisticated writer. It shows that we can make those big connections. So anytime we can do that, we should. So here's a diagram that if you haven't drawn or copied down anything else, I would copy down this, because this is kind of my go-to tool for writing introductions, and it's called the inverted method. Now, you might have seen this in other classes called the inverted pyramid. It's the same thing. I just call it something else, okay? But essentially, this means that when we write an introduction, we want to start very broad, because if we start broad, a lot of people can connect with that. A lot of people can relate to that. Then I'm going to narrow it into the specifics of my writing task, okay? So we start with that broad context. Then I'm going to narrow my focus. And I'm finally going to state my specific argument. And I emphasize specific because when we talk about thesis statements, we do want them to be really specific. But if we start really specific, it's kind of hard to get the audience to buy in because you're already kind of focused on your perspective. If we start with this broad context and kind of narrow it on our way down, we can engage them from the very beginning. So let's do an example. Be sure to write this example down so you can kind of use it later and on your assessment. But the first thing we want to talk about is broad context. And if my argument is going to be about perfection is good until it reaches a certain point, I think the things I'm going to talk about are mental health, but also perseverance. So one thing that I think about with the word perseverance is the common expression, practice makes perfect. We've all heard it 100 times. If I mention that to an audience, in most cases, I can assume they know what I'm talking about and they've heard that expression too. So I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to say something like, it's been said probably a million times that practice makes perfect. In other words, if we persevere and keep trying, we can achieve perfection. So I've kind of set up that quote that people know, but now, like I said, because my position is going to be to kind of challenge that a little bit about this idea that, but you have to know your limits. So I'm going to pose a question. Rhetorical questions are a great way to engage your audience, but I'm going to follow up. In other words, if we persevere and keep trying, we can achieve perfection. And I'm going to pose the question, but at what point do we have to accept defeat for our own well-being? Well-being. So this is my broader context part. So far, I've written this part right here. I've connected to this common expression people have heard. I've posed a question that kind of starts to challenge that a little. Now the next thing I want to do is narrow. I'm not going to jump into my thesis yet. I want to kind of elaborate on the question that I posed in hopes that it will kind of lead into my thesis statement. So I said, but at what point do we have to accept defeat for our own well-being? So now I'm going to kind of answer that question, explain it. There comes a point when striving for perfection, I'm using that from the task language, right, can become detrimental to one's mental health. Now, the next part I'm going to add is to present kind of the nuance of my my position, right? I'm not just saying striving for perfection is bad, it's going to hurt your mental health. I'm going to say it can be really good, but. So the next thing I'm going to say is, after there comes a point when striving for perfection can become detrimental to one's mental health, I'm going to say that doesn't mean we stop trying. And now I've kind of narrowed it, set it up for my argument, kind of created a transition from that first opening broader context into my thesis. So now I want to kind of finish this introduction. So there comes a point when striving for perfection can be detrimental to one's mental health. That doesn't mean we stop trying. So I'm going to say, basically kind of taking what I have right here when I kind of put my stance together, right? There is great value in striving for perfection. Again, using the task language. And I'm going to add, and achieving personal growth. However, and I'm going to do a semicolon. Semicolon is just a fancy period. However, achieving personal growth. However, everyone must respect their own limits along the way. And that is my thesis. So this would be my completed introduction. To kind of break it down one more time for you. From here to about here, this is where I'm doing that broader context, right? I related to a common expression that people would know and kind of made it engaging, and I also posed a rhetorical question. Then this part right here, this is when I'm kind of narrowing my focus. Another way to narrow focus is to kind of present both sides of an argument, which is kind of what I did, right? Talking about that comes a point where striving for perfection does become detrimental. Narrowing focus is usually a good time to present multiple arguments, because the last part, thesis, that's where you state your argument. So I just want to clarify, it's okay to talk about here's what other people think. It's actually really effective to kind of present the context and share what is out there and what people think. But you always, always, always want to make sure that you follow that immediately with, but here's the argument I'm going to make. So to kind of summarize up for us here, I'll put this back on the screen in case you're still writing. But the goal of a good introduction is to really address your task, purpose, and context, and that's our learning target. So when we're looking to kind of write appropriate to those different things, we want to think about context in terms of what is that big picture? Why are people going to care about this topic? What is something that I can do to engage these people in this big idea? We want to narrow it a little bit before we kind of really zero in on our purpose, which is where we state our thesis in order to kind of achieve that purpose. So that's our video. If you have questions, let me know. But again, that is how you write appropriate to task, purpose, and context of a rhetorical situation.